If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what are some terrifying paranormal experiences you've been through that still kind of freak you out? We're from Queensland, Australia. It was August of 2018, and we were on a 3-day school camp at Lake Mujera. The camp has 3 cabin areas located at a lower elevation, close to the lake, than the main camp and hall. On the second night, way past curfew, my friend Liam recalls that it was around 1 a.m. when he suddenly woke up to the sound of loud, deep, and slow breathing, unhuman-like. He was at the top bunk, close to the window, with no one beneath and only one other classmate across the room. The breathing had come from outside the cabin, about a few meters away, and lasted for around 20 to 30 minutes. There were no sounds of footsteps. Liam was lying face away from the window, with his backside up against the wall. Frightened, he didn't dare to turn around to look for what was making that sound. May I add that this camp does have horses on its grounds, however, they are in a stable a few kilometers away? For years, he's been boggled on what actually happened that night. We've deduced it may have been some Yowie, an Australian Bigfoot. But the lack of footsteps leads me to believe it may have been something more spiritual. I played a Ouija board with my sister and friends. The spirit we had contacted refused to speak to my sister, and when we asked why, it said that they didn't like her aura or attitude. At the time, this made absolutely no sense, but now, with context, it blows my mind. For some reason, several of the entities that resided in our house wouldn't go into my sister's room. So I'd sometimes sleep in her room to escape the constant torment. Now I realize that they wouldn't go in because my sister had a lot of intent and power behind her words. Each night, she'd tell the spirits or demons that they weren't allowed in her room and to stay out, so they did. My sister once told me that she'd always see shadows and creatures piled up at her door at night when I'd sleep in her room, and that was why she began shutting her door when she went to bed. I have no idea why or how she's able to do this, but I could never quite manage that myself. But even if they couldn't enter her room, they would linger in the doorway, but that's a story for a different day. To this day, even thinking about it makes the hair on the back of my neck rise. I was about 21. I was working a construction job in New Orleans during a hurricane, and I was standing out in the rain right after the eye passed. Around a corner comes this thing that, at first, I thought was a large dog about the size of a Great Pyrenees. This thing sees me, stands up on its hind legs, and roars loudly. I could feel this sound. A little voice in my head told me that if I ran, I would be dead. So the only thing I could think to do was put my hands up and yell back at it. After a second or two, it tilted its head like it was confused, dropped back down on all fours, and walked away. I ran inside once it was out of sight. A few years ago, I was doing laundry in my basement, and spooky things would always happen in that basement. Like the people before us who lived there, they drew weird pictures of entities in the laundry room. Anyway, I was folding laundry, trying to be productive, and I felt this weird energy go through me, and I got extremely dizzy. A few seconds after I felt that, I had never felt that before in my life, I felt someone or something grab my shoulder and shake me vigorously. Out of fear, I got up and ran up the stairs to the back door. As I was trying to unlock the door, something was keeping it locked, and I could physically not move the deadbolt. Once I got it opened, I ran outside and called my mom. She's a very spiritual woman. She told me to go back inside the house and to say it was not welcome in our home. I was shaking and honestly traumatized by that. That house had a lot of vibes, and it felt like you were being watched inside it. We smudged often because it's part of our culture to get bad spirits out. I heard my mom calling my name in the house. I went to her room to see what she wanted. The room was empty. I checked the entire house and couldn't find her. I called her cell phone to ask where she was. She was out running errands. I was home alone. What I heard was as clear as day. A few months later, my sister heard my mom calling my name outside her bedroom door late at night. She called my mom to ask if she was calling for me, but she said she was asleep. Later that same night, my grandma and grandpa, who lived in the back house, woke my mom up to let her know they heard a woman screaming in the backyard. That was nearly 20 years ago. I still have no idea what that was all about. One day, my girlfriend and I went on a late gas station run to get some snacks and stuff. That gas station is less than 3 minutes away, but on the way home, I turn on the street that my home street is off of. At that time, I stayed in a rough neighborhood, and a lot of the street lights did not work, were dim, or teens had shot them out, so it was pretty dark. As I was approaching a stop sign in my left ear, something, just a soft but firm, pretty assertive voice, told me, "Turn off your lights." The voice, or whatever it was repeated, was very rapid and continuous, like those people who read disclaimers at the end of a TV commercial. I couldn't tell if the voice was male or female. In my opinion, it could have been both. Now, referring to the lights, I was confused at first about what the voice was asking because I was driving, but all I could hear or focus on was that voice telling me to turn off my lights. I heard this quickly and continuously for about 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, I heard someone turn off the lights about 50 times just to put into perspective how fast the voice was speaking. Instinctively, I turned my headlights off. As soon as I did that, my girlfriend immediately asked, "What are you doing?" Then we both saw a glowing white ball shoot from behind treetops that did a little zigzag and vanished. We were both freaked out at that point, and she grabbed me, crying and asking what it was. I couldn't explain it. I told her about the voice I heard and what it told me to do. To this day, we talk about this random thing that happened about 3 to 4 years ago. This is the only one I have that I have no possible excuse for. Whenever we went on road trips when I was a kid, 1990s, my parents would put my brother and I to bed, then wake us up in the middle of the night to drive through the night so there'd be no traffic. We'd sleep the whole time and usually wake up at our destination. On this trip, we were driving from SC to see my father's family in Tennessee. So they wake us up, and we all load up in the car and hit the road. We turned out of our neighborhood and had to drive past this old cemetery that was right by the interstate, not even a mile from our house. As we were driving past, all of a sudden we all saw this ghostly woman right in front of the car, and all of us yelled, "Stop." My dad slammed on the brakes, but he went right through her. We all saw her as clear as day. She looked like a larger, older black woman, and when we saw her face, her eyes just looked like large black holes. I'll never forget the way her face looked. She was actually walking across the road right towards the cemetery, like she'd been out for a stroll and was going back to her resting place or something. When the car stopped, we all looked back, and there was nothing there. We sat there for a minute, and my mom was telling my dad to go back, but he said hell no and booked it onto the ramp. There was no sound or anything when we went through her, and we were all super freaked out. We all saw the exact same thing. As I grew older, I could never get this story out of my mind, so I finally decided to do some research on the cemetery, and it turns out that it is a historic African American cemetery. The town has kind of just grown up around it. I also found an article where they once found some unmarked graves in South Carolina that they determined were African American soldiers who died in the Civil War and were just buried in unmarked graves. They had a big ceremony and were relocated to this cemetery, but it was an African American cemetery long before that. From back when white people didn't want black people to be buried in their cemeteries. I lived in an apartment downtown above the greeting card store in Red Wing, Minnesota, about 20 years ago. It's a very old building, 1870. I was 20 when I signed the lease, and I celebrated my 21st birthday while living in that apartment. It was a fantastic location downtown. I didn't have a car, so I loved living only blocks from work, my best friend's house, and my parents' house. The rent was cheap. The apartment had nice, high ceilings and big architectural windows. I hardly had to pay for heat, as the store downstairs leaked heat up to me. It was a great apartment. I really loved the place when I first moved in. My opinion changed after having 2 supernatural experiences. I only lived there for a year and moved out the second my lease was up. I am not sure if it was a ghost or a malicious demonic spirit that I encountered there. I hope someone has blessed or exorcised the building by now. One evening, I saw the upper torso of a shadowy person peering around the door jamb while it was spying on me in my bedroom. It was completely black with no features. It had to be about 6 feet tall since its head was just below the door jamb and it was leaning to the side to peek around the doorway. As soon as I made eye contact, it immediately retreated behind the door. It was gone when I woke up my boyfriend, who had spent the night over. We wasted several minutes searching for an intruder. I was a skeptic at this point, and he was able to convince me that it must have been a nightmare. I never felt right in that apartment afterward. In another incident, I was home alone. It was daylight out. I was in the bedroom and heard someone rattling my apartment's door handle. It was very aggressive, and I assumed someone was trying to force their way into the apartment. I was extremely terrified, but I worked up the nerve to approach the door. I called out, but did not get any response from whoever was on the other side of the door. So I checked the peephole. There was no one in the hallway. The hallway does have a 90-degree turn in it, though, so I told myself that perhaps a prankster or burglar had fled when they heard me approach the door. I called the police, and an officer came to check. Since our building was secure and only the landlord and tenants had a key to the outside doors, it did not take him long to determine there was no one on the property that didn't belong there. I had him file the report, and for years I had convinced myself that a human being had been endangering me that day, not something supernatural. Now that I'm willing to admit to myself that there was something supernatural and very unfriendly in that building, I keep finding myself hoping something has been done to get rid of it. I can't help but ask if anyone else has had any experience in that building. I wonder if it was one entity or two different things. I can't really call myself a skeptic anymore, but I don't know what exactly it was I encountered. It was 1994. I was in my very early 20s, and I weighed 165 pounds of body-ripped meat. I had enjoyed success at wrestling in high school and had only increased my physical confidence in various activities since then. I was running a carpet cleaning van, and the hoses ran back to the van. I had specialized in vacant apartments. I had gotten a call from a regular customer who owned a row of townhomes off of a main street. It was July and 85 degrees. As soon as I opened the front door, I could tell something was off. I was uneasy going up the stairs. I did the 2 upstairs bedrooms and the hall, and then worked my way down the stairs. I began to sweat more heavily. I reached the bottom of the stairs and walked down the hallway, between the stairs and the kitchen, through to the main great room. All of the shades were up, and the room was lit with sunlight. Something was watching me. This was different than just being in the woods and being creeped out. Something was watching me. I knew that there was no way it was human, somehow. I began to run the wand in strokes, starting at the door and windows on the outside wall and working back further inside. My clothes were soaked through with sweat, and it was running down into my socks. I began to feel a presence building in the closet underneath the stairs. I could feel it swelling in power, malice, and evil. All of my alarms were going off. I began not caring about how my strokes looked, as I began working in such a way that my back was never to the closet door. The closer I got to the closet door, the faster my heart beat, my breathing became shallower, and my movements became very, very twitchy. I reached the whole carpet in front of the door. And by that time, I knew, beyond all that I held holy, logical, dear, and sane, that if I opened the door, something would happen to me that would be so awful that my mind would refuse to be capable of framing what it could be. There was no thinking. There was no rationality. There was only an overwhelming, paralyzing, and naked fear of meeting that entity. I could feel it watching, waiting for me. My body was shutting down. I was beyond fear. My head was throbbing with dread. I would have taken a shotgun blast to the head before I would have opened that door. I would have allowed horrific things to happen to my family before opening that door. I knew beyond all certainty that if I opened that door, not only would I lose my sanity, but my entire being, including my soul, would be ripped from me, and all I would know forever would be raw-throated, screaming bodiless torment. I scrapped the rest of the hall, dragged everything out the front door, and closed it. I felt physically sick, drained, and soaked in sweat. The entity was still in there, waiting for me, but it wasn't moving. Thank you, God. Closing the front door reduced the intensity of the terror, and I was able to cope with getting everything back to the van. After collecting myself at the van, I returned to speak to the manager. I asked casually if there was anything unusual about the apartment, but the manager did not have any information. I remember being sensitive when I was young, but no more than other young children my age. The sensitivity left me eventually, as it does with children, particularly as I was raised Catholic. I left during the Clinton administration. As a recovering Catholic, I do acknowledge the existence of God spiritually. It has never been an overwhelming, strong connection, just the kind of one that sits on the back burner and sputters up from time to time. I can more strongly vouch for the concrete existence of timeless, nameless, formless evil. I have felt it, and there is nothing that anybody has said or shown me so far to make me doubt or dismiss it. My memory today is crystal clear, other than my exit. I chose that day to deliberately close myself off from any sensitivity at all. I never had anything after I was a kid anyway, so it wasn't that hard, but there was no way I was going to encourage further experiences. And nothing has happened to me since. Little Lake Salem, Derby, Vermont. In the summer of 1996, my family and I, 3 children and parents, stayed at a little lake adjacent to a camp with cabins. I was almost 12 years old at the time, so I was definitely old enough to remember it all clearly. One of the first things we noticed was that there were no wildlife sounds at all around the lake. My mother was and still is an avid walker and will walk several miles a day, even now into her 60s. The dirt road leading away from the campground into the woods had a small footbridge over a creek bed. She would insist that she could not cross this bridge without feeling cold and fearful. As a group, we all walked over the bridge, continued going, and came to farmland, where there was a creepy, Deliverance-style homestead and a small child playing outside who wouldn't speak but played in some bushes and petted a cow with us. This trip is one of my earliest formative memories of creepy things. Upon returning home to Lower New England, We spoke to the people who rented us the cottage, and they claimed that there was an Abenaki Indian burial ground where there had been some sort of battle in the 1800s where that creek bed lies. It was apparently discovered when the ground was broken to make cabins. About a year ago, me, my wife, and my kids went to visit my cousin and his family for a couple of weeks. While we were in North Carolina at my cousin's house, he and his wife told us countless stories of having sleep paralysis and coming face to face with a night hag. They described it as a woman with long, floating black hair and pale skin with a purple aura around her who was trying to attack them. They woke up with scratches and bruises and showed me the pictures. When we came back home to Virginia about a couple weeks later, I was sleeping on my side and my wife was lying next to me. I suddenly woke up and couldn't move, speak, or do anything at all. My vision was blurry, but then it started to clear up. When it cleared up, I saw what I believe was the night hag my cousin and his wife had been encountering. It never messed with me in any way, but it hovered over my wife for a couple minutes. I saw it whispering in my fiancée's ear and caressing her. I was terrified. It knew I was looking at it, but it never acknowledged me. I eventually fell back asleep when I woke up the next morning. I told my fiancée, and she said she was having bad dreams that night, and when she looked at her body, she had scratches. I'm wondering if anyone else has had similar experiences? I don't know if you call this paranormal, but one thing I'm unable to shake off is an experience I had when I was around 5 or 6 years old. My sister, 15/16 at the time, had a friend over, and they were running in the backyard. I remember running around trying to play with them until I heard something along the lines of PSSSD. Hi. We had a wooden fence in that area, and I looked up, and there was this entity with blacked out eyes staring at me. It had a wooden upside down triangular face with Robin Hood looking attire and was in a gargoyle-like pose. It scared the shit out of me and made me scream, so my sister and her friend ran to help me and searched for it to no avail. Sometime later, my mom was doing laundry, located in the garage, and I wanted to ride a rocking horse we had in there. I remember riding and hearing a tapping noise. I looked up towards the garage door, it had windows located up top, and there was the same entity looking at me through the window, and it was fucking waving hi. I screamed, and my mom looked out the windows and saw nothing. I don't know what the heck that was, but yeah, I think about it from time to time, and it definitely freaks me out. This happened around 1 a.m. on the outskirts of a little town that my family cemetery is located in, and my girlfriend and I were roughly 2 to 3 miles from the cemetery when this occurred. I'm Native American and was explaining that we typically don't visit our loved ones' graves late at night in my tribe, so we don't disturb them or bring home something bad, and if she were to see something, then to tell me so we could quickly leave. As I'm explaining things that she may or may not encounter on the property, we both see a man's silhouette cross the street ahead of us and cross the street walking in our direction, but as he got to the oncoming traffic side of the street, he gradually seemed to vanish into thin air. There were no businesses or homes close by for at least a 15-minute drive, so it was odd to see someone walking this dark road so late at night, but neither of us called it out until we got to where we should have been right next to him, so when I didn't see him, I mentioned it, and she told me she saw the exact same man cross the road and disappear in the same way. Things went over as well as they could for a late-night cemetery visit with no strange happenings, but the thought of seeing that man cross the street and just fade away still gives me goosebumps. This experience happened when my wife and I stayed in Banff National Park for the week back in September last year. We've always paid a visit to this beautiful landscape whenever we visit my folks in Calgary, Alberta. Although we didn't think we would have a paranormal experience this time around. We try to do excursions that we haven't done yet every time we make a visit, a mix of touristy things and non-touristy stuff. Near the end of our trip, we were scheduled to visit the Cave and Basin, which was a 7-minute bus ride from Banff town. We decided to go upon opening so that we could avoid the crowds and have lots of time to do other things on our list that day. A bit of info for those who haven't been to the Cave and Basin, or Banff, for that matter, is that from what we read, it is a kind of museum where they show how Banff was rediscovered by Canadian railway workers back in 1883. It was rediscovered because this national park was, and still is, a sacred land for Indigenous people. It had been like this for centuries before it was rediscovered. We came into the entrance of the tunnel to the cave, where these railway workers were said to have dug through and discovered a large sulfur well. This sacred cave was used by Indigenous people as a place for healing. Going through the tunnel is dark, and its only light source is above the well itself, where the sunlight peeks through. It was quiet and eerie walking through the dark tunnel. I can hear whispers even if we were the only ones going in. Then something told my wife not to look into the water in the well. She said after that she may not have liked it if she looked down there. We didn't stay too long in the cave, as it started feeling claustrophobic and the smell of sulfur was unbearable. My wife told me what she felt when we came out of it. I told her that I did not see anything, and I looked into the well myself. Little did I know at the time that this creepy experience wouldn't end here. Next, we continued the tour and made our way to the top of the building, where a bridge connects the museum to the forest of Sulphur Mountain. As we crossed over, we saw a small cabin that served as lodging for the railway workers back then. We were right above the cave that we were just in about half an hour ago. The cabin was surrounded by a large forest, ascending up the mountain. And right when my wife was reading information about this cabin, I felt a dreadful feeling. A feeling I'm familiar with when there's a spirit or entity in the midst. It also felt like there were a number of people watching over us, even if it was just the two of us up here. As I looked from left to right, my eyes were drawn to the tall trees at the far back. And there I saw a dark entity so massive and tall that it stood as tall as the tree beside it. Though I cannot see its face, I knew it was staring at us, as if guarding the area. It did not feel like a ghost, but like a spirit or entity that felt so old, maybe as old as the forest itself. I felt that we weren't welcome here anymore. I then motioned to my wife that we cut our time here, and we left with haste. It was only after we left the grounds that I told my wife what I saw. Seeing an entity like that was understandable, knowing how sacred that place is for indigenous people. So whenever you get the chance to visit Banff or these national parks, learn the history and respect the land, its people, and the unseen guards. My father enjoys recounting the tale about the time he experienced paranormal activity in an area north of our community called Ferry Run. Well, in the mid-late 90s, my father was an avid outdoor sportsman and frequented a lot of the same ponds to trout. One such pond is named Pike's Pond. Pike's Pond is situated in a small valley, almost dead center, between my community and the neighboring community to the north. Now most of this valley and the surrounding hills are home to Ferry Run. It was in the winter, there was snow on the ground, but the pond wasn't frozen over. My dad took the morning to try and catch some trout. After an hour or so of being completely alone, he heard what sounded like two teenage boys having a conversation, walking down the hill over the marsh towards the pond. He heard the voices get louder as if they were getting closer, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. The instant that the two boys should have walked out of the tree line and into the clearing, the voices stopped. My father thought nothing of it at the time. He figured that maybe the boys saw him and just didn't want to share the pond, so he turned around and walked back. But when my father packed up to leave and started to walk back home, over the marsh and up the hill, he noticed there was only one set of footprints in the snow. Those footprints were the ones that he made when he walked down to the pond. There should have been 3 sets of prints coming down and 2 going back up. This really freaked out my father. He isn't the type of guy to lie to someone, and why would he lie to me? It's not like he's trying to keep me away from there. I'm a grown man now. Anyway, I believe every word. It was summertime in Minnesota. I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and I was having a sleepover on the porch with a family friend. For reference, the porch is a rather small square room with a door connecting to the dining room and windows on every other wall. It was late. I always stayed up later than most kids, so it wasn't abnormal, but my family friend was asleep. I was bored, so I got up from the floor to look out of the windows. This was at my grandma's house, and she lives in the countryside, so her backyard was all woods. I sat up on an exercise bike to look outside more comfortably. It was dark, but the moon made enough light for me to still see the grass. I was looking around for animals since there were often deer or rabbits. That's when it happened. A golden light flew right past the window in front of me. It would have been maybe 3 inches from my face if the glass hadn't been there. The light was pretty large to miss. It was about the size of a baseball and moved very fast. I remember running to wake up my family friend, exclaiming that I just saw a fairy. The next day, there was no sign of any damage to the grass. This memory is very vivid for me. I don't think it was a fairy anymore, but anything is possible. If anyone knows what this could have been, I'd love to hear your ideas of what I might have seen. When I was about 8, my family and I moved into a new house. My mom grew up about 10 houses down from our new house and had heard stories about this one in particular because of a little girl who had been killed in front of it by a car. Anyway, since we had just moved in, we didn't have any curtains up over the bedroom windows. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night, sometime after midnight. I went to the bathroom and came back to my room, which was shared with my little brother, who was 3 at the time. We slept in bunk beds, with him on top in a twin and me on the bottom in a full-sized bed. I climbed up and checked on him. He was out cold. Then I decided to go look out our window, which overlooked the backyard. I didn't see anything as I walked to the window, just blackness since it was so late at night. Then, just as I got to the window and really looked out of it, I saw something. I couldn't really tell what it was at first, but after a second of looking at it, I saw a face. Not a human face. It was round, almost a perfect circle, but was torn down the middle. There was an eye on either side, also perfectly round. The face itself was white, like a sheet of paper, but the eyes flashed different colors, mostly white, red, and black. This thing had a mouth, also on both sides of the face, but it was more like a gash. It was hanging open but twisted upwards, kind of like a smile and bright red. The two halves of the face tapered closer together at the lower part of the face you looked at and were joined just under the circle by a rope. It was braided just like a normal rope. This thing is very hard to describe, but if you want me to, I can draw a picture and post it later, after my son goes to bed. It just stared at me for a minute or so before it terrified me so much that I ran screaming from my room and into my parents' bed. My mom still remembers me blubbering about this thing. Does anyone have any clue what it could have been? Or to try to debunk it? I have been wondering for years what this could have been. This was also my first experience in that house, but I have seen a few more as well as other things that happen at other houses, though I never saw another thing like this. When I was in my teens in the early 90s, I would say 14 or 15, the house I lived in was haunted. It was on a road that was bordered by a railroad track and surrounded by large factories. My house was a single-story dwelling on the corner of my road, which people would speed down. The house itself was haunted for this, I have no doubt. One night, as I slept in a converted dining room, which was my bedroom at the time, my blankets were tugged off of me. I slept on the bottom of a cheap bunk bed. Something I remember vividly, because at the time I thought my dogs were lying on the corner of my blankets, slowly tugging them off. I would wake up and look at the four corners of my bed to see nothing. Then one night I was woken up by someone screaming, "Hey kid!" It jerked me awake, and I remember seeing an old lady hanging off the top bunk looking down at me. Her hair was tangled and looked like an old mop head. She was ashen-faced and angry looking. There are several other encounters in that house. But this is the most surreal one I have. I am not one for really visual dreams. So, I am sure this is an actual occurrence. This happened to me in my early teens. I'm 21 now. My best friend growing up had this huge farmhouse in the middle of Virginia. It was very old and beautiful, but it also had a very dark history. In the house, there is a tunnel that leads to an underground room of sorts that was used for slaves to hide in the 1800s. And I'm 90% sure that some died down there while in hiding. So you can imagine the history and energy that fill the house. I always felt scared there. I never felt alone and wouldn't go anywhere alone in the house, even just to grab something out of my room. Even the family was scared to stay there with no company because of the intense apparitions and experiences, which I can get into another day. The rooms were massive, and the entire house was white with honestly creepy vintage decor. There was even a cabinet of fucking ventriloquist dolls upstairs. No joke. They were a really odd family, honestly, with lots of dark problems. Anyway, the second time I visited that house, I was with my mom, my best friend at the time, and her mom. It was a girls' trip. One night I woke up and was so thirsty, and the last thing I wanted to fucking do was go down the stairs and get water. I was terrified. I hated that house at night, but my mom was dead asleep, so I literally sprinted downstairs with my head only looking at the floor. I made my water in 5 seconds, and when I made it to the stairs, something compelled me to look at the giant glass doors that were in front of the stairs. I was horrified, but I felt like I needed to look out the window. What I saw when I looked out that window will haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw a man, as real as anything I've ever seen. It was pitch black outside with a huge, bright moon. The man was all black, like a silhouette, but because the moon was so bright, I could clearly see his entire body. He was blacker than black, like he stood out so much that I 100% thought he was a trespasser. He was wearing a top hat and was unhumanly tall. Like 7 feet. My heart literally felt like it had stopped beating. I felt like I was in a trace. I was so unexplainably horrified, but I couldn't look away. He was moving a little bit, almost like breathing. Then, about 10 seconds later, he was gone. Disappearing into thin air. I fucking panicked and bolted upstairs after I snapped out of my trance. I cried to my mom and was up all night. The next morning, I told my friend and her mom about the experience, and they were not shocked at all. They had seen multiple full-body apparitions in the house themselves. The nanny who worked for them even refused to go into some rooms of the house. I never went back to that house again. This was a story my grandmother told me once when we went to our ancestral home in the province, about a 3-hour drive from the city. The province has a metropolitan area that is just like any busy city, but there are rice fields, stretches of woodland, and densely covered mountains. When she was young and it was Holy Week or Halloween, I don't remember when she said this happened, People usually came together to visit their dead in the cemetery and then go home to feast and drink. On one of these occasions, just as the sun set, my grandmother heard her mother start screaming and ordering all the children to run up to the second floor. There's a living room there that has a big window, and it's where you get to all the other rooms upstairs. So my grandmother did as she was told, and so did all the other kids. The men started shouting and moving outside the house, while the women ran up the stairs too. Then, the kids were asked to sit together really closely while the women formed a circle around them and began praying loudly, the rosary and Catholic prayers. When it was completely dark, my grandmother began to hear something thumping on the window and the roof. It was an old house with the second floor completely made of wood, so it was very easy to hear. There were scary screeches and the sound of something scratching and scrabbling on the window. The women prayed louder, and the thumping and scratching got more desperate, mixed in with some screeching. There was also another sound that my grandmother didn't realize until the height of it, which was the flapping of a pair of great wings. The noise outside and the non-stop chanting of prayers really terrified my grandmother, but to add to that, her own mother took up a large knife, the ones used for cutting bushes out or killing livestock, and began running around the room, shouting and cursing, "Get away from here, you monster, you aren't taking any of the children." I don't remember if this all lasted until morning or just an hour or so. But afterwards, when my grandmother asked, her mother told her that an aswang or local vampiric monster was spotted and was heading to their house. She told me this story on a similar Halloween/Holy Week night, and it's made me afraid to sleep in our ancestral home ever again. My parents built a 3-story house there, so we all had a room, parents, their friends from California, and an aunt who stayed in another room. Despite all those people in the house, I felt something was off. They told me that I was adjusting, that they still hadn't called the priest to bless the house, and that when he came, everyone would feel better. Anyway, bedtime came, and my brother and I decided to sleep in my parents' bedroom the first night. I know we were old, but every other room was taken or filled with boxes, so since it was a big master bedroom, we placed our sleeping bags on the floor and called it a day. Sadly, I'm always the last one to go to sleep, so there I am waiting to fall asleep when I start feeling the room go cold. I thought nothing of it, but then I started feeling very scared for no reason. I did what we all do at that age and wrapped myself in a blanket. I thought it was all in my head, but then I heard a dog breathing close to my ear and I knew that my brother was around the other side, so it wasn't him. I was really scared now, but I also feared for my family. I am the oldest. Since they were all asleep in an act of desperation and fear, I got up only to find nothing was there. I woke my dad up and told him what happened. He just thought I was exaggerating and told me to pray and sleep. This time I slept a little closer to them, and right when I was about to go to sleep, a solid steel door we have at our entrance slammed so hard that everyone jumped and woke up. This had never happened before, and 12 years later it never happened again. There was no wind at all, and nobody could explain how it opened without the key. They all started talking, and then they looked at me and told me to go to sleep, so I left. I woke up the next morning, and as I was making my cereal bowl, my mom asked me what I saw or heard. I told her, and she just went pale. She said my aunt and our 2 guests saw a woman in white walk down the stairs. Moments later, the door slammed shut. We looked, and 7 people couldn't be wrong. This was one of many things to happen in our house, including 4 years of sleep paralysis daily. My memory isn't the best, but I'm pretty sure I was in middle school when this happened. One of my sister's friends was spending the night, and I was sort of hanging out with them. When my grandma went to bed, they decided to sneak out and go for a walk, so, being the follower that I was, I went with her. They went to the neighborhood adjacent to ours, and there's this one road in particular that has little to no street lights, so it's pretty creepy. They kept joking about something following us, and, I'm not going to lie, it psyched me out. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, we spotted an orb. It was just a bright light lazily floating across the road, and it was pretty close to us, so I'm not sure how we didn't notice it sooner. My sister and her friend ran immediately, but, like a white woman in a horror movie, I lingered for a second. I just stared at it, but being surrounded by darkness and trees, where anything can be lingering, with only the creepy floating orb was pretty scary to me, so I turned tail and ran in the direction the other 2 went. That's pretty much it. I recently asked my sister if she remembered it, and she said, yeah, but she didn't seem that interested in what it actually was. We lost touch with the other girl a while ago, so I can't ask her. I've considered possibilities for what it was, but nothing adds up, so I'm here to get others' opinions. If I'm remembering it correctly, it was the size of a baby's fist, and I think it had a bluish tint. If you've ever seen a drawing of a will-o'-the-wisp, it sort of reminds me of that. I am a female in my early 20s. This happened almost 13 years ago, when I was 11 years old. As a child, I was delighted by the thought of ghosts and liked knowing that if a loved one passed, they would be around me. I have had countless encounters with the supernatural. I've seen my grandmother, grandfather, godfather, my cousin, who committed suicide, and other spirits who are just passing through the house. My seeing them didn't start until we moved. The house we moved into was just down the street from our old house. These houses were built on land that used to be an old swamp, where countless people were killed, had accidents, or committed suicide. I know such a lovely place to build houses on, but let's jump to a week after we were finally all moved in, when I started to feel uncomfortable being left alone for more than a few minutes at a time. I felt like I always had eyes on me and like someone was always behind me, breathing on my neck when no one was around, and my room was 10 times worse than any other room in the house. I have never felt comfortable in there at any point unless I had someone with me. I always felt as if I was being watched by something I couldn't see, but I could feel it around me. I would have horrible nightmares of me being chased by something invisible that wanted to harm me, and no matter where I went or where I would hide, he would always find me. I would always wake up before he could do anything, but I would always see his hands extended like he was going to strangle me. I then started sleeping in bed with my mother, and the dream stopped. I slept in her bed for 2 weeks, and then one night she told me I had to sleep in my own bed and that everything was going to be alright. I begged and pleaded for her not to make me go into my room, but she told me I was just being silly and that nothing was in there that would hurt me, so she tucked me in, sat beside me, and patted my back till I fell asleep. That's when the dream started. I was running in the forest away from this shadow man. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was around 5 feet 11 inches with a medium build, wearing a long black trench coat, an all-black Panama hat, and heavy-sounding boots. I couldn't see his face or anything other than this shadow of a man coming after me and wanting to hurt me. Every time I tried to stop and hide, he would appear right behind me or in front of me, forcing me to change directions, which led me to the edge of a cliff. But just as I was about to jump off and get away from him, I woke up in a cold sweat. My heart was racing, and I felt like I needed to get out of my room, so I crawled into bed with my mother. I was about to close my eyes when I saw him. He was walking down the hall towards her room and stopped in the doorway staring at me. Then he began to walk slowly but swiftly towards me, and I just laid there frozen in fear as this shadow man was standing over me. Now I shut my eyes, waiting for something to happen. When I thought it was over, I opened my eyes to see him beside the bed, leaning over me with his hands out like he was going to strangle me. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move, so I shut my eyes again, about to wet myself from being so scared, and began to pray. Just as I started praying, I felt like the shadow man was sitting on my chest, making it hard to breathe, so I opened my eyes as I gasped for air for what felt like forever. Just as I was about to pass out, the shadow man vanished into thin air, and I never saw him again after that night. But since my 21st birthday, in the corner of my room behind my bedroom door, there's been this dark shadow that just watches me. I had a friend who swore he was psychic. He read tarot cards for people and was pretty good at it, but I never believed in psychics. This will be important later. I was 18, living with my parents, and got up at 5 a.m. so I could work at 6. The stairs were in my parents' room and led down to the living room. I didn't ever turn on lights, so I wouldn't wake them. The stairs go down 10 steps to the wall, then turn 90 degrees and have 5 more steps. I started down the steps and saw someone standing in the middle of the living room in the dark. I assumed it was my dad because of the shape and size. As I was walking down, he walked across the living room and started up the steps. When he got to the 5th step and turned towards me, I realized it wasn't my dad. It was like a solid shadow standing in the middle of the stairs. This wasn't a shadow on the wall, it was a shadowy figure, and it was still walking towards me. I tried to back up quickly without turning away from it. I slipped and fell on my butt. It went through me and disappeared at the top of the stairs. My heart was pounding. My mom woke up after hearing me fall and asked if I was okay. I didn't have time to explain, so I said I fell, but I'm okay. I went to work. Around 8 a.m., while working at the gas station, my psychic friend walked in. He asked if I was okay. I looked around and didn't see anything suspicious going on outside or anything, and I said I was fine. Why? He said that at exactly 5:15, when I was walking downstairs, he was woken up because he could feel my fear. Before I could even tell him what happened, and I hadn't told anybody what happened yet, he told me that what I saw was a shadow person, and it meant me no harm. Since then, I have believed he was psychic. When I was 21, I was still living at home and just finishing my degree. I was particularly stressed as I was daunted by the paperwork to apply for a government position in child protection, working in that high-stress industry, and by the prospect of having to move away for work if it was necessary. Come bedtime. I'm in bed in my room, trying to doze off to sleep. But I'm still a bit stressed. As my eyes are closed, I feel this need to open them to look. Right in front of my face is the most terrifying face I have ever seen, grinning with a freakishly big smile at me. It appeared like a man but demonic, with plain white eyes, too big of a wide smile, white skin, and spiky ginger hair. I was absolutely terrified. I'm thinking, what is this? Is this real? It can't be real, just close your eyes and open them again, and it will be gone. So that's what I do, I slam shut my eyes and open them again. It's still there. I basically shit a brick and feel the panic rise in my chest to let out a scream. As this happens, it kind of goes backwards and fades away, leaving me in this traumatized state. Eventually, I'm brave enough to get out of bed, turn my light on, and sleep with it on and my TV on. I have never been so terrified. My dad believed me and told the spirit to leave, and I did the same every night. I slept with the TV on for light and comfort for weeks. Occasionally I felt like I was being watched from outside for a period of time after, and once I thought I saw it in the bushes at night watching me with that face. I'm 36 now, and nothing has come close to the terror I felt that night. I once saw this really nice necklace on an online auction, and I just placed my bid, and I actually won. The seller was a German man, and it took a while for my package to arrive. I was super proud of my new necklace, and I started wearing it from the exact moment I held it first in my hands. After a month of wearing it, weird things started happening to me. 2 events occurred. The first one was a Sunday or Saturday morning, and I remember being very relaxed and hearing the voice of a little girl talking to me, even though I couldn't understand what she said. I didn't see her, I just heard her. Everyone in my house was asleep, so it made me freak out. The second event occurred on a Wednesday night. It was around 10 p.m., and I usually go to bed at around 9 or 9:30. It takes me a long time to fall asleep. I was feeling relaxed, and I was half asleep and half awake. I realized I was listening to a female voice humming a tune that I could recognize, even though my parents were downstairs and my brothers were sleeping. It scared me a lot at first, but I didn't really mind, and I just let myself fall asleep. I talked to my mother about what was happening, and we had a long talk in private. I often see weird things, and weird things often happen to me, but this time I told someone about it. My mom was trying to understand for what reason this would happen to me. She thought it was maybe something in my room, and in that exact moment when she said that, I thought about my necklace. It was a necklace from the years 1920 to 1930. So yeah, I just poured some holy water on it, and I just had a few events after that, but they were probably only my imagination running wild. I still have the necklace now, and I wear it every day. I feel like the memories of the girl who had this necklace before me are still inside the necklace, and I don't really mind. Actually, I'm happy that a part of her is still in there. I just really can't explain why. Well, yep, this is one of my creepiest experiences. I'm that kind of person who doesn't believe in ghosts, magic, or other stuff. I always had a rational and scientific view of reality, but that night, my God, something happened. Let's start. 29th of May 2021, Italy. It started as a usual weekend. I was at a friend's home with other friends drinking something, chatting and playing games. When it's summer sometimes we decide to go outside for a walk. It was night around 11:30 p.m. cloudy, but you could still easily see where you were going. We live in a countryside place but not too much away from the nearest city. It's the typical Tuscany landscape. Anyway, we take the usual dirt road that is in front of the house. As we walk down this road, a friend, let's call it M, goes a bit further than us, and another friend that was with him come back to us saying that he lost him in a matter of seconds. How? From this point things got creepy. We started searching with torches, maybe he fell on the sides, we call it, but nothing. I arrived at the end of the road, and still nothing had vanished. The road is around 200 meters straight, plain, and has a dead end. How can someone disappear if you have it in front of you? Fine, maybe he came back to home, we thought, so half of the group backtracked to home to check, while me and the other 2 friends remained at the dead end. Later, we got messages that he was not at home, so we too started coming back. When we have nearly arrived, M reappears from the road running towards us. At first, he thought that we had made up some kind of bad joke about him, but no. He then explained what happened from his point of view. As we all saw, M was just walking by itself, a bit further than us. When he reached the dead end, he realized that we weren't there behind him anymore, no torchlights, no voices, nothing. From his point of view, we were the ones that vanished, so he too backtracked to home, but there was no one there, so then he came back to the dead end, doing the same road from start to finish 3 fucking times and nothing. We live in this place, and we would know where we are with our eyes closed. There are no roads similar to that nearby, and it's literally impossible to miss each other on a straight, plain road. So how has all this happened? We thought about it all night, searching for some kind of explanation of what we had witnessed, but how can you explain this? That night haunts me for days. I was 18. For years, I had been practicing street magic. Sleight of hand stuff and tricks. All normal kid stuff. One day my dad, a very dedicated religious man, came to me and asked, "Have you been doing any black magic or anything evil?" I said no. He didn't respond. I said, "Why do you ask?" He tells me, "I was attacked last night by an evil spirit." He goes on to describe what I now recognize as sleep paralysis. He said an entity, a demon, got on his chest, and he couldn't move or breathe. However, he mentioned something else. That it was making this growling noise, like deep and evil. Well, thanks for that. But I was sure it had nothing to do with me, so we went on our way. That night, I was the only one home. Which is very unusual since I have 6 siblings all at home. Extra scary detail, we live far away from anyone or anything deep in the woods. There are no neighbors, and at night, it is pure black outside the house in all directions due to the thick canopy of trees. And our living room has large windows on all 3 sides. So it's like a panorama in pitch black. Which means whatever is outside can see you. But you can't see anything. So here I am. At night, I was sitting in the living room watching a show, but quietly, as it was unusual to be alone and I felt like I needed to be quiet. When I am above the kitchen, our bedroom for the majority of the kids, including you, I can hear one of the bunk beds starting to move. If you've ever touched one of those old metal twins on top of full bunk beds, you know what I mean, and it started to bag against the wall slightly. So I was just going to pretend like I didn't hear that. But then I hear footsteps. And they get loud. My house is a cabin, so the sound gets through the floor very easily, but I mean, this was no tiptoeing lightweight thing. It was practically stomping. And it didn't stop. I was curled up like a ball on the couch. But you could see up into the second story from the spot I was at on the couch, and right where I could see was the door to our room. I was so scared of seeing it walk out that I yelled at it, telling it to leave. And to my horror, I heard the growl. It was no one. I can't even describe it in words. It was deep, angry, big, and not human. And I never went home if I was going to be alone again. But I also didn't have any other issues, so, this was 2003 or 2004, early summer. I was a teenager. I was visiting my mother. At the time, she was living with her husband in a pretty rural area of Monroe County, Michigan. He was decently well off and had a nice, big house on a few acres of land. There were railroad tracks not even a mile up the road from us, and there was forest past the road in front of the house. I was visiting for the weekend. Things kind of came together in a series of weird events. Me and my mom were in the basement, messing around on the computer. We just got DSL internet at the time and were downloading music off Kazaa, really dating myself here, and playing stupid flash games. Eventually, my mom goes upstairs, and I keep messing around on the computer. Not long after that, the internet stopped working. I wait for a few minutes for it to come back on, thinking it was maybe a bad connection or something, but it doesn't, and I have a mixed feeling of boredom and that weird feeling of becoming aware of being alone. So I go upstairs to find Mom. The first thing I notice is that it's night outside and all the lights are off, so I call for my mom, and she's in her bedroom down the hall. She shushed me and told me to come over to her room. On my way down the hall, I notice the railroad is going off. When I get to her room, my mom is over by her window, peeking through the blinds into the front yard. I ask her what's going on and why she has the lights off, and she tells me to be quiet and to come take a look through the window. So I do, and I immediately see what she was looking at, 2 amber/orange orbs flying back and forth low in the sky. It is hard to get perspective and judge distance on orbs of light, but our best guess was that it was just above the tree line in the small forest past the road. I should also point out that the railroad is also somewhat adjacent to this small wooded area. We watch for a solid 3 to 5 minutes, and the orbs aren't leaving. Me and my mom ask each other if we should go on the porch for a better look, and we muster up the courage to do so. I want to point out that so far, this definitely feels off, nothing about it feels normal. So we step outside, and we get an even better look at the orbs. It's very clear that these are not flashlights, not laser pointers, not spotlights, and not remote-controlled helicopters. They moved quickly and sometimes synchronized, sometimes independently. Another thing we noticed was that, even though the tracks were going off, there was no train. We could see the tracks were empty, but the signals and lights were going off, and the barrier thing was blocking the road regardless. So far, at least 10 minutes of me witnessing this have been happening. I don't know how long my mom watched before I came upstairs. This was no trick of the mind or out of the corner of the eye type situation. This was a dragged out encounter. We just stood on the porch, dumbstruck, watching something we couldn't comprehend. After a couple more minutes, the orbs came together to be next to each other and shot off very quickly into the distance and out of sight, about 10 seconds after the train track stopped. I feel immediately better, but it's about to get worse. Me and my mom are still kind of standing on the porch, just talking to each other a little, like, "Wow, did you see that?" Or "That was so weird." Dumb stuff like that. We are both still kind of looking into the forest, and that's when we see it. I shit you not, to this day, I still get chills and remember it vividly. A humanoid silhouette that seems to be about 7 or 8 feet tall of muscular build just kind of appeared in front of the forest. It had glowing red eyes. This is probably about 50 or so yards away. Me and my mom both see it and immediately panic, run inside, and shut the door. We look at each other and ask each other if we saw it, and we confirm with each other that we're not crazy. I ask my mom if she has a gun in the house, and she doesn't. The best we had was a baseball bat and a big kitchen knife. We take them and hide out in the basement. At that point, our strange event is over, but me and my mom are freaked out beyond belief. We go over the details with each other a couple times and just kind of hang out together for the rest of the night. There's a fold-out bed in the basement. We both stay down there. My mom eventually fell asleep, but I didn't. I was still too nervous for the rest of the night. Most of the people I've told the story to can tell that they don't believe me, or at best think I'm exaggerating my claims. I'm a fairly skeptical person, and I might be able to write off the orbs as just witnessing something totally normal that could possibly have just looked impossible from my perspective, but that shadowy figure just messed me up. To this day, I have no idea what any of that was. I am very reluctant to say UFO or alien encounter or anything like that, because I'm not exactly sure what we experienced, but I can absolutely without a doubt say that something did indeed happen that night, continued to happen over the course of 15 to 30 minutes at least, and was experienced by 2 people. Me and my mom would bring it up to each other every now and then. I haven't had any other experiences since. So I've wanted to share this story for a long time due to some recent events. It started way before I was even born, so I suppose I should be there. First, I should say that although I was raised believing in aliens and ghosts and all sorts of paranormal or supernatural things, I do keep a healthy level of skepticism about myself. I don't equate everything to ghosts or other things. With that out of the way, on with the story. As I said, this begins with my mom. It began in the house my grandparents currently live in and that I lived in until I was 5 years old. My mom shared a room with her younger sister for quite some time, this time while she was in elementary school. They had beds adjacent to one another and a closet at the foot of their beds. Before the incident described, my mom had no problem with an open closet, but now she doesn't even let me or my siblings sleep with a closet open. It was a reoccurring thing that would happen when my mom would leave a closet open that she would wake up in the night and look over to her sister. Floating above her sister would be this black mass with glowing red eyes that would look at my mom when she noticed the thing. Once it saw my mom, it would return to the closet and turn into this large shadow man with red eyes. This entity was coined the Dark Man by my mom. Whatever it was, obviously scared my mom to have lasting effects to this day. I've had weird experiences my entire life. With a chaotic home life after my parents' divorce when I was a year old, I suppose I would be an easy target. I'm not saying these were directly the Dark Man or even specifically a ghost, just a strange occurrence. The first was the fact I had nightmares every night while at my mom's, grandparents', until I got a dream catcher and moved out at 5. There are other small incidents, such as orbs in photos. I took consecutive ones in the same place so it wasn't dust or bugs or on the lens, footsteps walking down the hallway at 3 a.m. while everyone was asleep, feelings of being watched, and just general unease. That was all well and good, nothing serious until I used the Ouija board. I'm aware I was stupid to do so, but I thought it was a hoax, in all honesty. But after I did, I had the first nightmare in 9 years where my family was killed by a dark figure. I also had things like pots on the drying rack that could not have just fallen, causing noise by falling to the ground, people talking when I'm home alone, and other small things. But about a month ago, that was what made me write this. I do deal with depression and anxiety, so I'm on medication for it, but it's never caused sleep paralysis or any other sort of weird effect on my sleep. But one night I had fallen asleep around 10:30 just watching Vines, don't judge, so my mind wasn't on anything scary or paranormal when I fell asleep. I hadn't even gotten into any real dreams that I remember when I heard a voice telling me to wake up. When I did, I immediately saw a black figure standing over me. I could move, so it wasn't sleep paralysis since I was able to turn on my flashlight and run upstairs after less than a minute, after I had recovered from the shock. I had only been asleep for an hour, exactly 11:30 when I was able to grab my phone for the flashlight. I had my stepdad check the entire basement, but there was nowhere someone could have entered or left as quick as they did without being heard. The only possible explanation is a hallucination, but I've never hallucinated or had anything like that where I didn't know I was asleep. And to add to that, the day before I found a baby picture of mine turned upside down in a way only a person could have deliberately done. And given that my door is locked until I'm in it, there is no logical explanation. In any case, I hope to never see the figure again. Back when I was a small fry, my sisters and I would always go over to our neighbor's house to listen to her tell stories as we watched her sew. She is still alive today at the age of 88, so in this story, she is around 78. I was about 10 years old when this happened to me, so the details are a little fuzzy regarding every detail, but not in the instance of the creatures I saw. I live in a rural southern town, so Native American roots are still prominent here. I have Cherokee in my blood as well, but not much to consider myself a part of the heritage. Anyway, whenever my sisters and I would go over to my neighbor Virginia's house, we would always get to spend time with her son, who is now deceased. I would take more time than my siblings to listen to his jokes and stories, but there was one occasion that he joked with me about that ultimately he wasn't kidding about. My street has an odd name since it is derived from the Cherokee language. We always have to spell it out for people when we are required to give our address. However, when I asked why the name of the street was so weird, my neighbor's son responded, "Don't you know? Our very street was paved over an Indian burial ground." I didn't believe him until my own eyes betrayed me. One night, I was out in the garage playing with 2 Barbie dolls. The garage we had back then had 4 square-shaped windows lined across it, so anyone could look in and see into the garage, just like I could see out. From where I sat, the shed we had was to the left of the side of the house, with the places for cars lined up beside it and a hill descending down the driveway. The shed had an overhead light to be able to see, and a street light was right down the driveway, so the possibility of what I saw just being a shadow seems impossible. My parents were inside, along with my 2 sisters. I had a habit of liking to play by myself. As I was playing, I suddenly had chills go up my spine, and the lights in the garage and outside flickered. I look up and see a tall, black human-like thing outside. It was shaped like a human and dressed like a human, but the eyes, there was no reflection in the eyes for me to see. It was pure black. The face itself, from what I recall, had no features except for when the mouth opened. It had sharp teeth sticking out like spikes. I screamed, and my parents came to see what was wrong. I told them someone was outside, and my dad went to look. When he came back, he told me no one was there. Another time, I saw a little girl who was dark complexed at the edge of my bed. She had dark brown hair, and she was smiling at me. She wore a brown dress that didn't look like anything I would recognize as modern fashion. She was the only friendly being I saw, and she disappeared once I saw the scariest thing in my bedroom. In the months after the very first encounter I had with the shadowy man, I didn't see him at all. I turned 11 in August and had more things to do and worry about. Time quickly made me nearly forget my experience, but he came back after I saw the little girl for the first time. I remember the first night I saw him. I had had a really bad nightmare. I don't recall what the dream was, but when I woke up, I was covered in sweat and my pillow was soaked with blood. I looked over, and the shadowy figure I saw that day was hunched over in my bedroom. I heard a growling sound, and it rose up to its full height. My walls are 9 feet high. This creature's head touched the top. I couldn't move, and I couldn't scream. It leaned over me and said, "I can't have your heart, but I can take your mind." I shut my eyes at that, and when I opened them, it was gone. But it came back. It kept continuing like that every 2 to 3 nights, and I would wake up to my nose bleeding and my sheets covered in blood. This continued for several months, to no avail. I couldn't sleep in my room anymore. I had to sleep with my mom or dad to receive respite from it. Every time I went into my room, I felt heavy. It felt like I couldn't breathe every time I went in there. I can't explain it, but I also felt a sort of evil spirit in there that my parents couldn't feel. After 8 months of not sleeping properly and talking to therapists and doctors who couldn't figure out what to do, we talked to my pastor, who recommended we do a cleansing of my room with holy water and oil. My mom and I would touch every corner and entrance so no demon or supernatural being could get into my room. We took his advice, and I was able to sleep peacefully for the next few years. However, after I got out of the hospital for my mental health needs, it came back. I am almost 20 now, and he has come back into my nightmares for the past 4 years. I haven't seen him in my room physically, only in my dreams. I don't get the nosebleeds as much anymore, but I wake up sometimes and notice I have scratch marks on me, and I don't keep any pets inside. However, I'm afraid that if I see him physically again, it'll be too late. I am only a teen, but but I have lived in the same house all my life, so I have seen some pretty weird things, but nothing I thought was odd due to living here for my entire life so far. That is until December of 2014, because that's when something happened that never happened before we saw something. At that time, my room was being remodeled, so I slept on an air mattress in the living room. I was sitting on it, and my mom was in the kitchen cooking dinner. I looked back as I was facing the TV away from the hallway. I saw something dart into my room at the end of the hallway, and that's when my mom asked if I had just walked down the hallway because I had the tendency to skip around due to my ADHD, and I replied, "No, but that means you saw it." She turned around and said, "I saw you skipping around, and that's what I'm sticking to until tomorrow morning." My mom doesn't like the supernatural because of a whole other story involving a Ouija. After that, things just got weirder. We heard things like a little girl giggling, and things would get misplaced but would reappears minutes later. It wouldn't be until about February of 2015 that I would have the creepiest experience of my life. I was still sleeping on the air mattress, and I woke up in the middle of the night with a little note about where my mattress was in the living room. It was in the corner under the TV, and I could see into the kitchen, and half of the hallway in the living room. Near the wall next to the hallway is the sofa. I sat up to go to the bathroom, rubbed my eyes, and grabbed my glasses so I knew I wasn't dreaming when I put them on and looked at the hallway. I stopped because sitting on the arm of the sofa was a solid figure of a man reading a book. I blinked a couple of times, and he looked up. "I'm sorry, did I wake you?" He closed the book, placed it on the table, and walked down the hallway out of my view, and I heard the creak of my door. I knew it was mine because my door is the only one that still creaks because it's the only one that hasn't been replaced. I went back to sleep. I could wait until morning to use the bathroom. When I got up, the book was on the table. It was there the day before, but my bookmark was on a different page than where I left it. I never saw anything again for a while, just hearing names being called, giggling at a little girl, and knocking at the front door every night. That is, until the summer of 2016, I was left alone. My mom had run to the store, my brother was asleep, and my dad was at work. I was sitting on the couch when I started watching TV. I got up and passed the hallway, and I saw someone just taller than I am now, so maybe 5 feet 4 inches. I got my drink out of the fridge, walked by again and again, and it was still there. I sat on the couch, looked over, and saw it peeking around the corner. I heard it giggle. I came to the conclusion that the little girl was more of a rambunctious teen, and I just kept watching TV. I would look back, and she would look toward the TV. It was like a game to her. Don't let me catch her staring, and she wins. It wasn't creepy because I felt as if she was just bored. This only went on for maybe a minute at most, but it felt like an hour when my mom came home. I heard giggling, and my door opened and closed. My mom looked at me and said, "Is that the other Marie?" I shook my head and told her to ignore it. I never thought anything of them other than being the spirits of people who passed away here, and that's until this past summer of 2017. I am back in my room, as it was finished earlier that year. I first heard a knock at my door and a voice call me a Bic. I presumed it was the other Marie because we had become very close and would jokingly call each other things like that, and it sounded like her, so I walked up front after not seeing her in the hallway and asked if she was here. My mom shook her head. I went back to my room and then heard what I thought was my dad calling my name. I went up front again, and my dad said he hadn't called my name. I told him all of this, and he said that as long as he lived in this neighborhood, he has lived in this neighborhood since he was young, the only person he knew died here. After asking older people who lived here longer than him when he was buying it, it was an old lady. The previous owner died of a heart attack in a corner of the living room. That's when it hit me. I heard a male voice then, and that night, that little girl looked like she was dressed in stuff from the Full House series, so that didn't make sense. Who are these people, the man and the girl? I then heard something that was commonplace to me, jazz music, even though my dad, the only person that would be playing it, just left to go ride his bike. I don't mind it, but I still have these questions. It's almost Halloween, and the only thing that is going on is the usual knocking at the front door. The only weird thing to happen is me getting locked out of my room twice. I feel like my room isn't my room anymore. I grew up in Ohio in the 1970s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, and practice making fire with sticks for the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country. But instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers, we discovered bridges no one went to, we fished, we hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small, hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun that we did it multiple times. I never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but we always stayed in touch and tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family during the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came, and we started out early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I said, "What the hell?" And off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thickly forested area with trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything on top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer, just to be sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all, it was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in, we didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to the spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness that seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks, go to sleep, and move on in the early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days, it was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. But it was nearly pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church. And the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, A booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually it got to the point where a single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the fuck out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. I'm not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods.